So, dear friends, dear participants of Mannsein 2021, I'm looking very much forward to the next issue, which will be moderated by another gentleman. During the next session, the next interview, you will have an opportunity to ask your questions at any point in time. Whenever you feel like asking a question, you can place your question in the chat here in the team. Your questions will be collected and then they will be forwarded to the moderator that I'm going to present to you. So if you have any questions, write them down in the chat and they will be answered soon. So the moderator, I'm very much looking for Hajo Schumacher has become a very important and dear man in my life. During the Corona time, we strolled through the Tiergarten, which is a park here in Berlin, and we chatted as two men, and we told each other wonderful stories. I cannot retell them. We gave each other food for thought. Why was it so full of content? Hajo Schumacher is a jack of all the trades. He's a famous journalist, he's a speaker, he's a family man. He wrote the Männer Spagat, the men's split, and I find it so great that he gives away his time to us to interview two very special men. I pass over the word to Hajo Schumacher. Hello, Hajo. Hi, John. Thank you very much. Well, we had found a sort of arrangement. The two guests that I'm going to torture for you, I'm not going to present them because I planned something with them. Thank you very much. They are father and son, certainly not unknown to everybody. It goes without saying that presenting themselves as father and son is not a matter of course. Matthias Horx, many of us can know him as futurologist, as Mr. Megatrend, someone giving advice to companies. He's simply one of the masterminds of our country, although he lives in Austria, and he's got a son, Tristan Horx. If I may say so, he is stepping in the footsteps of his father. Before I read out Wikipedia entries, hello, dear Matthias, dear Tristan, can you hear me? Does this link work? I come from sports, which in itself brings a different haircut. I remember you had a mane like a hippie. My wife told me you cannot age with dignity. Probably I get some stylish counseling from Tristan. Well, things don't look better in my case. The two of you. So let's go on a first name basis. Du in German, it's the weaker journalists do not love working. So part of my work will be delegated. Dear Tristan, how would you present Matthias Horx to a group of more than 100 men that I do not know so much? Brain, I find this idea of a brain, well, futurologist, well, most of the times people will associate something that is certainly not hitting the nail on the head. Brain would be a good caption for my father. He is not, he does not live with his feet on the planet Earth alone. He's always on his way in other worlds. So a brain on the way in an otherworldly dimension, which is a rather unusual presentation. You left out the biographical connection. Matthias, how would you present Tristan? Well, from a narcissistic, my very gifted son, who also embodies so many parts and components. I come from the anti-authoritarian movement. So our feeling was always that children need to be radically different from their parents, but we have a permanent friendship. Tristan, my son, and I, we are linked and we are bonded, which is quite surprising and baffling. I simply believe that, well, I compare it to my own self-identity. I think he's got my type of energy, unbelievable masculine energies, but on today's level, probably we are more interesting as different people, which brings in this generational issue. I am a kid of the 70s. I came full circle of all those learning curves and trends. I find it so exciting to see how Tristan goes through the educational process, the socialization process differently. But he has probably also the same type of curiosity. So the brain is probably not so different. He's more body. He is very much into sports. I have never reached the same level, but I have practiced and I have exercised. Siad Roger, do you get a six-pack? Do you have one? Well, I used to have one before Corona, a six-pack. Now it has become a one-pack. I'm working on my second six-pack. Well, I have listened to Siad Roger. I have gone down from 117 kilograms to 80. So I certainly can understand. But right now, I'm not having a six-pack. So we share this, the fate. I have got a son, mid-20s. If I had told him we are friends, well, I'm not sure whether he would have always agreed. If the old man tries to rub elbows with the son, is it embarrassing or is it true? Well, I would subscribe to it because also in the style, having reached a higher age, well, he had less paternalistic trends because a patronizing attitude would certainly ruin friendships. That was not the case. Given the same professional orientation, albeit all the differences, you encounter each other differently. I think this cooperative competition that we are practicing would not work if we had not a sensible friendship as the basis. Yes, I will subscribe to it. Friendship. We all know those stories, be it Franz Beckenbauer's son or Helmut Kohl's sons, or I do not know whether Prince Charles is a case in point. Being the son of a prominent figure, let alone a brainy celebrity, do you feel that you are Tristan, or are you the son of the old Horx? Well, it changes through time because at the beginning of the career, quite often, as always, even more today, but in this context, during events, I'm a speaker. Well, the moderation, the presentation was always the same, that I was presented as Matthias Horx's son. In August, my first essay book will be published, which certainly strikes a different. He has taken this book. Has he read your book? Yes. Yeah. So, yes, the answer is yes. Yes, of course, I asked for advice. My first book, I do not know the inner workings of the book market. So it was not a problem at all to ask for help. It somehow started, well, the father's shadow, if you put it pathetically, in the biography book. Well, he was quoted, and then you've got the problem in front of you. There was also an op-ed in the press, a newspaper in Austria. Well, he was quoted every now and then by a teacher in the classroom. So, which brought a certain dynamism into the interaction. It's exciting to see how we treat similar paths in our professional career. But in the meantime, do you want the old Horx or the young one with the big mouth, Matthias Horx? I would not be so. I would not be as disrespectful to the big mouth, but well, his voice sounds loud and strong. Well, you are educated as a kid of the 70s. The image of masculinity of the Frankfurt area, the riots of the 68 movement, being a father, well, was this part of your future planning? It has always been a topic. My first job as a student was to become a point of reference in a kindergarten. And the kids kept asking me, do we still have to do what we want to do? I was a softie. I am a softie. You are anti-authoritarian. Yes, I have tried to integrate the feminine parts in my identity, which was a huge issue. Many failed in their lives or in their relationships. As back then, I would still uphold this thesis with the proviso that behind the anti-authoritarian attitude, there was quite often also a narcissism of neglect. The parents wanted to do their thing and children came on top of it, or they were dragged along. I perceive this. Even in my young years, I studied role models, man, woman. It was a taboo topic. But there were also kids in certain offices. The narcissism of parents, parental narcissism, which also led to the rejection of paternal roles. The outcome of this can be seen to the present day. I cannot give any piece of advice anytime to my kids. If you refrain from it altogether, then it's again wrong. So you should not be, you are always supposed not to be a true man, but if you are one, are you not one, then it's again wrong. At the end, it's the heart, the true emotional bond that moves you out of your inner self or the only self. If you open up to other human beings, if you have a certain maturity, probably not as exaggerated as the previous speaker put it, but then you will also avoid those tragedies. We have really so many tragedies. Children of celebrities that end up in utter despair and in total failure. We have so many successful stories of, for example, Frank Zappa's children developed into autonomous musicians. So there is no natural. Matthias, were you always aware that given your celebrity, you are a special father? That this could be an additional burden. I'm not a classical celebrity. I'm not made for celebrity because you have to play certain roles. I'm still in my inner self, a provocative agent. Well, my old spontaneous instinct drives me to push the borderlines. If you are really a celebrity, I'm not a real celebrity, you know. I'm very happy that you are not sitting all the time there. The new shows, because the television does not know what to send. You have those eternal shows. You see all the time the same old celebrities. It's a torture. I find it terrible. But that's exactly what celebrity is made of. You were mentioned in the geography textbook that was read in Tristan's school. I have not reached that point. Let me take one step backwards. Matthias, what type of family did you come from? You are the classic generation of the 68 kids where the parents were somehow involved with World War II. My father, yes, it was informed. My father was a deeply unhappy, a traumatized man, almost choking to death emotionally. He was so pent up. He tried to fill it up with all sorts of rambunctious shouting around. He was certainly in despair. It took me a long time to understand him. We tried to free ourselves, for example, through sexuality. There were lots of theories about the inhibited personality formed by the authoritarianism. If I look at the populism, I see the old faces, shitty faces, I must say. So faces in which life is not thriving. Tristan, the next generation after the son's generation, there is also a new discipline, epigenetics. Epigenetics believes to be able to prove that traumata are passed on through generations, not inherited, but are passed on. These traumas will then be settled or will dissolve. Do you still feel something from the heritage of your World War II grandfather? I find this exciting. In my latest, in my first book, I study this problem of intergenerational conflicts and traumas. Well, I am in a way the result of the healing. My father has married an English woman. I'm a peace child. I think this is part of the healing process. On the other hand, I think my father informed me very well about what had happened. I think in this 68 movement, the protest movement, there was a moment of sitting down in our family. This was not pent up as a family secret. No, it was explicitly mentioned and we worked through it. Could you describe such a situation? How old were you? Where were you? Did he tell you, well, let me take you aside, I need to talk to you openly? Well, I was a socialist with those brains over evening, over supper, and I was too young. There was this time when the information was just trickling through. You did not have the knowledge to understand but when I had checked out it, when I had come to terms with it emotionally, we were on a boat somewhere in the Caribbean Sea. Where was that? Well, I am afraid of sharks. So it was, we went to the upper deck, and now he started out telling me the family story and the painful components that are built into family stories. They were addressed very honestly and with great vigor. It was not a conflict as such, but it was a painful process to delve into this heritage that might be epigenetically built into my identity. This also questioned my legitimacy as a human being, I would say. I never knew my father's father because he had died just before my birth. In the German military, and the English family was also a family of militaries. If the former enemies have, I feel rather nationless. I think it's also an example of the success model Europe in both families. In the parents' generations, we have this usual bourgeois manner of silencing certain problems and remaining silent about the traumata. How can you solve this? From my perspective, it feels as if we were on a good family path. Tristan, how did Matthias teach you masculinity? Was it a topic at all? That was, for example, planting a tree or chopping wood or what? I hope I'm not being unfair to you. At the very beginning, well, the question, what about masculinity? Well, masculinity is a very hard and exclusively masculine topic. I see this in a more differentiated way, especially in the younger generation. However, the classical, being a man, manlyhood, that comes rather from my English grandfather. He's also a hermetic, brainy man, living in his books and so. So that's the way you hit the nail on the head. It was delegated to other hippie friends. Hans, for example, your friend. Yes, we were quite clever in delegating this. I do not feel short-thrifted, but we mentioned this already. There is a certain masculine trend or attitude in me that is probably stronger in me than in you, Dad.
So you're like a young macho? Well, yes, in a way. Well, I'm not saying this reproachfully, and on the contrary, I'm almost a bit envious. Well, yes, of course, because the male role is always characterized by ambiguities, by ambivalence. The question is, how much do you depend on women? And then there are these cultural struggles, these cultural fights going on in all the relations between the genders. But of course, we also have a certain pluralism now. Many of our friends are gay. So in a way, you always encounter this combination of what is male and what is female. In every human being, you find both. But it's very interesting because Tristan is very careless there. He sometimes says things that, well, can you give us an example? Well, yes. What I would never have dared to say at this age because I wanted to be politically correct. I don't want to give you any examples, but you mean macho style? Is that what is the way he sometimes talks? Well, yes, I think you can guess. You know, as a young man, sometimes when you start to discover the other sex, the other gender. Okay, but Tristan, did Matthias tell you about sexes, about the difference between men and women and so on? Did that really happen? The birds and the bees? Yes, he told me about that. But the more traumatic memory is, well, when they told us about that at school, you know, with all our friends, you know, we were. But yes, my father also explained the basics to me. I think my mother also did. She also told me something about that, even though I don't quite remember it. You see, back then, when everything was in the past, when everything was very Catholic, of course, this was a big moment, you know, the birds and the bees. But I was different. You mean you had already heard about all of that on the schoolyard? Yes, maybe with some misinformation, but some of the mechanical process was quite clear to me. And how did Matthias explain to you women as a human being, as a creature? Well, I think the concept of women that I have is mainly characterized by my mother. And I think that's what also left its mark on my perception of women. Oh, Dad, do you remember ever having told me anything about women, the type of woman I should look for, what makes a good woman? No, I think my German grandmother, she once told me about that, but not my father. Did your grandmother tell you that a woman has to be blonde? Yeah, she said, at least she said that I should be careful not to get a foreigner pregnant because she only wants my money. You share this opinion? No, of course I don't. Does that mean they don't want your money? They just want your body? Well, in the past, they want my body. I have to get back there again. I have to work on that. Okay, Matthias, you know, typically, sooner or later, the father and the mother will compete, consciously or subconsciously, for the mother's affection. Did you also have this rivalry? No, I don't really think that Tristan has such a strong Oedipus complex. I mean, that's, of course, the typical pattern that you just described. But from the men's movement, we also know that there's another. Women, at least some women, are quite obtrusive. They really try to, well, influence men very strongly. They have a strong influence on the man. But the question of autonomy is not a question of man versus woman. And it's also a question that gay men are confronted with. So you have this personal autonomy, and on the other hand, you have your relationship. And the question is then, to what extent can your partner determine your daily life? And there are many couples where it's actually the woman who, well, has the main impact on the life of that couple. I don't have any problem with female aspects in my characters. I love to bake cakes, for example, but still, this concept, these conflicts, they keep coming up over and over again. This kind of, well, for example, the parents being too obtrusive, the parents trying to control the child, the parents trying to teach the child what to do and what to think. And here the question is always, where do you draw the dividing line? Is this just about being interested in the other person, or is it really about giving the other person freedom and liberties? I mean, that's the eternal fight between men and women, between sons and mothers, daughters and fathers. It's kind of a fight you've always had. And here, of course, in that fight, sometimes men show solidarity with each other. So when such a conflict arises, then often I'm on Tristan's side. But that's something you have in every family, I think. And we also have a very big family with many members. This typical shattered post-World War II, post-war family, which means we have lots of relatives who also had different concepts and different ways to lead their lives. Okay. Now, maybe we can have some questions now. Dear men, no matter what you want to know from the two of them, as you may have noticed by now, they're very open. They are very open to all kinds of questions. So fire away. Okay, here we have two questions related to the age. One man says, I'd like to know the birth year. I mean, in which year Matthias's father was born. By the way, my father would have been 100 now. Matthias, when was your father born? My father, I have to calculate. I'm 66 now, and he was 66 when he died. So during the Second World War, he was between 17 and 22 years old. Must have been born something like in 1922, 1924. Okay. Now, Tristan, how old were you when you were on that boat in the Caribbean talking about the family history? Well, I must have been 18 or 19. My adolescence started a bit late, obviously. But anyway, back then, I think it was the right time because I was able to understand the context. I was able to understand the whole thing, the story, the context. Because typically when you're an adolescent and you're rebellious, then that's not the right time to talk about that kind of thing. Maybe that was the right time to talk about such a serious topic. Okay, next question. How did you, Tristan, develop your macho attitude? To There was a time when I was overweight, and of course I had this feeling that women didn't want me and so on. So I really lost weight. I mean, I worked very hard to lose weight. And all of a sudden, I had the impression that women did want me. It was quite sought after, so to speak, on the market. But I have this tendency to exaggerate things sometimes, and that's why I really turned this into my identity, the guy loved by women. Does that mean you define your value as a man on the basis of your attractiveness for women? Well, back then, I mean, I'm more mature now. I was like 21 back then. Well, that's not so long ago. Well, my hair is starting to turn gray. That was just a phase and it's over. Quite an egalitarian approach, not so chauvinist, not so authoritarian. So I didn't really have any problems there, but that was one short rebellious phase I had where I wanted to be different than my father. Of course, there are lots of young men who start thinking that in those terms and never get rid of their macho attitude anymore. It was just a short phase for me that ended in a catharsis, so it doesn't have to go on forever, such a phase. By the way, if I'm too curious, if I'm too obtrusive, tell me. But Tristan, are you a classic heterosexual man? Yes. Well, I'm just asking because at least here in Berlin, in your generation, people like to play with gender identities. You don't have these extreme poles anymore. It's more like a slider. You can go back and forth. If a man feels a bit female today, then he will wear a skirt. Do you also have this lust to, or this interest to try different roles, try to play different roles? No, you see, when I was young, I mean, I played American football for 4 years, and I think that's how I was, taught to be male. Well, yes, of course, in American football, you only have tough heterosexuals. Well, okay, well, some of these things that happened in the showers back then, well, that was just boys being boys. But of course, American football, that was a chauvinist male culture. And it really took me a few years to get rid of it again, to let go of that again. I don't know where that comes from. Maybe my dad can explain that or analyze that from a psychological standpoint. But hair on your chest, loud, thinking a bit, that's me. The classic, pure, hetero things. That's pretty much my cup of tea. Well, but you can say the same thing about gay men. And somebody from the 68 generation teaches or raises a young man, then you can't make him the enemy of Alice Schwarzer, the enemy of feminism and I wrote so much about love and sex and education, and based on what I've read, and based on my my own experience, human beings as a species prefer monogamy. And of course, if you live in a diverse society, then you will have these mixed forms of sexual identity. This has always been the case in every culture. But I think this the male and the female as two fallback options are much stronger than we all believe. That's why we keep focusing on them so much, when in fact the problems take place on a whole different level. So here I think psychology really plays a big role. You're saying the problems are taking place on a different level. Can you take us to that level, please? Well, yes, the problems, or the problem is when you think about the whole development of mankind and the development of humankind, then it's obviously infantilization of roles. Roles are becoming something infantile. It was the same with the hunters and gatherers. Back then you had a certain range of supermen, hypermen, who may have been sexually attractive. But in the process of cultural differentiation, there were more and more patterns, more and more there was more infantilization, because men can't be men if they fall back to alternistic forms, to anger. That's something that happens quite often to men, but it does happen to women as well. They can also fall into the infantilization trap, in particular in a narcissistic, and in a society characterized by narcissistic ideals like ours, where everybody has to look like a doll or a puppet. Now, I remember there was a time when men with long hair were loved by gay people. You know, back then I was a long-haired hippie. And then after a while, it turned out that the strong women, the strong women, the emancipated women, one day you saw them with, well, some macho from Jamaica, tough guy, and then they sent them back home after a year or so. But there is also a female machismo, and that's, we get caught up in this network of contradictions for our entire lives. We can never solve that. So we are, of course, also human beings with erotic, that react to erotic or aggressive or female temptations. That's the way biology has programmed us. But then again, there is a culture that says that all of that is mad. So with all this genderism that is currently going on, I have to say that there are also some developments that are problematic. For example, when people keep going back and forth in their identity, then that isn't very helpful for their soul either. It is tough. The whole political correctness leads to a situation where society gets destroyed. So I think it makes more sense to have an integrated perception, an integrated concept of masculinity and femininity. And this concept has to be flexible, but it shouldn't deny the existence of the male and the female. There are these basic patterns of behavior that result from evolution, and that's not by chance. They do exist, and we should accept that rather than trying to blow them up or destroy them. Okay, before we come to the next round of questions from the audience, maybe a little game. Tristan, can you please give us 3 attributes of a good modern man? 3 attributes. Okay, a good modern man. First of all, egalitarian. I think that's a very central thing. Egalitarian. Egalitarian. Okay, that means a good modern man should not be top-down or hierarchical in his attitude. Yes, exactly. Egalitarian. I mean, we're probably talking about the ideal man here. Maybe that's utopian, but, well, for example, when you think of a perfect brother. Okay, egalitarian. All. That I also use as a gauge when I think about myself in order to see if I really live up to these standards. So egalitarian, thing that often are in an identity crisis, and quite often you could call this agency in English, agency. That accepts his task and also, well, takes things in his own hands to change his environment and his context. So agency, yeah, controlling the things around you and making a difference. Responsibility is quite a passive thing, but agency is something active. Okay, Matthias, 3 attributes of a good modern man. Well, the ability to make decisions. Taking decisions, that's something male. And I also think that self-confidence as well. I mean, of course, even an arrogant asshole can be self-confident, but self-confidence really in the sense of being aware of yourself. Self-awareness is perhaps the better word. Self-awareness. And then you should also be active and vital. Externally, you should take action externally and be vital. Again, this leads me back to the hunters and gatherers, and the same ideals. Back then, when our forefathers were hunters and gatherers, the men went out to hunt. And when they came back home and without an elephant, then of course their women would make fun of them. Man. Of course, in the idea of fascism, the idea of the heroic man is the idea of a man who can do anything. But the risk is that if you deny these perverted images of fascism, you will deny the whole concept of masculinity, and the whole thing becomes very vague. And that's one problem that my generation had, that men were so vague and unclear and couldn't make any decision. And that's something. That's what they say about the soft guys as well. Typically soft guys, softies, they were never able to take any decisions. So being able to make a decision, that is important. And of course, women can also have that attribute. Are you friends on the same level, or are you like father and son? Well, I think you can't make that distinction so clearly. I think maybe I'm wrong, but sooner or later, you reach that age where you don't have the typical father-son hierarchy anymore. I think at least when I'll be 30 years old, we won't have this age-based hierarchy anymore. So the two extremes that you just mentioned keep, mixing, and it all becomes the same, more or less. Well, this is also related to the fight for respect and recognition. So I think the whole thing will only work if I recognize, if I appreciate Tristan's achievements, and do not just apply my own standards to him. And of course, I also want to gain his appreciation, his recognition in my life. Is it easy for you, Matthias, to let go? To let your son become a man on his own, in his own right? I'm asking you because I also have a son, and it was extremely difficult for me to let go, to let him grow up and become a man. Yes, well, it's probably different with Tristan than it was with your son, because Tristan was always his own man, so to speak. So I didn't really feel this moment had come that I now have to get to let go of him. Yeah, but when you say this, it really sounds like a loving compliment. Yeah, I don't think this was an insult. Okay, when did Matthias tell you the last time that he loves you? Good question. Or that he's proud of you? Well, that can't be so long ago. Well, that's just a sentence I would not utter. I mean, even though I love him, I would not say I love you. That's something I would say to my wife. Yes, maybe the word love is really something that you say to your wife and not so much to your son. That's true. My grandfather, he speaks English. So when we send each other messages or mails, then we will write love at the end of the message. But in German, you don't really do that. When you say I love you in German, it's typically between romantic sexual partners, the sentence I love you. But saying something like I'm proud of you. Yeah, I think a few weeks ago he said that in the context of this first book of mine. It's quite tough for me to write this book. It was tough for me to write the book, and then I was looking for a publisher. I really did that on my own, with my own agent, and I got a contract with a publishing house. That was quite a process, and I think we have a right to be proud of that. Okay, next question. What other topics, when you think about the topics related to masculinity that your generation deals with, what is different about them than the topics that your father's generation thinks about? Well, but of course, this leads to many problems as well. For example, the question is, who can be my role model? what is a role model at all. And you can really see that many men, they drop out of the masculinity team. And then in the US, you see quite a lot of men who really still try to follow this role. I mean, like John Peterson, Joe Rogan, for example, men who try to follow and support this idea of traditional masculinity. And now with this hyper masculinization that takes place, in particular in the social media, for example, when you see a picture of a man who is in good shape, of course, they're all on testosterone. Don't kid yourself, it's obvious. But many men feel that they can't compete with these role models, and that's why they drop out. They leave this movement. They say, I don't care anymore.
So the world becomes ever more feminine. And in this split, in this conundrum, the men fall out altogether. This is the problem. I have this healthy, coercive optimism of my father in myself. The young man, this is the one, but I would say the young man is the one cohort that provides me worries. Loneliness, we have so many loners. And Matthias, how and when did you recognize, when you can address what issue with your son, the family history? Was it a rather instinct-driven thing? Well, of course, one of the biggest educational problems is this flood of optimization and advisory books, because every relationship is individual. You are in a relationship, you feel it, you know when it's about time. Of course, so much is subjective. I have always this aspiration or this urge to communicate my own neurosis. It's not just information. That's the way I am. It's also an aspiration to legitimize oneself on this wonderful sailing boat, the Sea Cloud. We travel around the globe, and we had so much time because you cannot go off board. What will be the outfall of the corona crisis for masculinity in society? Do you see any connection? Well, my assumption is that those countries that have true leaders that are very much bent upon this uga machismo, they have utterly failed. But Boris Johnson, they got but they have also lost the highest number of victims. What's your measure? How many people have been vaccinated? And the fatality rate, the death rate is rather the relevant criterion, I would say. So in that respect, look at the model of New Zealand. A female leadership style, a non-military leadership style is certainly superior to the masculine leadership style. What I just see in my friends, in my peer group, there is a kickstart for a second 68 Samba. They meet up again and they just want to go to bed together. To put it bluntly, it's a sort of kickstart for this sexual dynamic as in many other camps. This summer will be really cool, really good. Probably you need to go through such a period of sexual withdrawal, physical withdrawal. Masculinity and corona, Matthias. Well, such a deep crisis has always the potential to accelerate a latent trend, but while at the same time also disrupting other curves. It's like laundry machine, a washing machine that brings things in disorder. Authoritarianism once again lifts its head. We see dictators all around the world bucking up, and we know that they all know that they are a threatened species, and they try to fight it out. Think of Belarus. In those countries, we are going to see a time of rebellion, and where women are going to play a totally different role, but they play with the fire. While at the same time, however, this is something that had been simmering all along the way. So women are more and more pushing for positions of power. Also for the simple fact that women have been more successful. Journalists have also gotten it wrong. They generated huge death rates, and then they have tried to buy up vaccines. To a certain degree, they succeeded in doing so. This centrifuge of the masculine and feminine principle has been exaggerated once again, and there will be heavy fights. Let's look forward because the perspective is what is the future? Matthias, where do you see sources of a newly defined identity of masculinity? Looking at the startups, for example, taken up by women, what will happen then? What are the resources for me to draw upon my masculinity? I don't know. I'm still exploring. They're diverse and diverse role models for men. The men of the future will have other tasks on their hand because we had for such a long time such an dominant patriarchy. Many think that the end of manhood is near. I would say it will flatten out with all this talk about masculinity and masculine identities. The interesting thing about men and women is what makes them different, what also makes the whole thing attractive. I think we are too much into apocalypse, that, for example, the male principle is going to be replaced, or there will still be professional profiles and ideals that are rather pursued by women and by men. Probably the distances will shorten. The identity shaping of the future, well, I find it frightening because what is identity shaping? You say identity shaping. I do not have any. Women can also fight like men, but with other means. The differences between the men and women are came about in biologically totally different settings. They are slowly dissolving in societies where we don't need it any longer. There are the old reflexes. Do we still need this? Is my identity shaped by masculinity? Or would I rather say my profession as a futurologist or a gardener or an aging man? So adaptivity will probably be higher. We are going to learn to cope better with our male components because we have got to. It always boils down to the question, are men the only violent human beings? Even passive violence can be very aggressive and also brutal. probably we should loosen up the question of identity. Probably in ourselves we have so many souls. I myself have got several souls in my body. I feel better if I do not have to draw a clear-cut line, but a multiple bundle of phenomena of beings. Sorry to say we are at a men's conference. We want clear-cut answers and well-defined objectives. No, men are not always so crystal clear. This question that we have asked ourselves even hundreds of years ago, the concept of masculinity, does it make sense after all? I do not know. I see images where men can become pregnant in the biological sense. These are trends that seem to indicate basically that we have an androgynous ideal to the extreme. We have also so many. We will have an incredible blend of mixtures. Every animal will find its counterpart. Tristan, if there was an opportunity for, would you carry as a pregnant man the baby of your female partner? No. That's exactly the clarity. The men's congress. Okay, good, great. Men's conference. Yeah, clarity, clear cut, crystal clear answers. I found this very interesting. This German-British World War II topic. You have a rather male audience. Probably you are close. The audience is here closer by age to your father and myself. We do not want to end up on this heap of rubbish of the old white men, because the piles are growing. I have just finished my book on the new intergenerational contract, a book about you, the old white men. In the end, well, I ended up with the following insight. On the one hand, probably you need to move away from your ego, that the youngsters talk disparagingly about the old ones, while the old ones talk disparagingly about the young generations that dependent upon the smartphones and so on. If you shed all those prejudices, you will be confronted less and less with prejudices. Yes, of course, we've got to learn, and I'm deeply convinced. Yes, you have built a cool world with masculinity of the 21st century. The individualization and the diversity that we enjoy has also created the wealth. So please do not take your criticism towards you as a negationist approach. We do not want to deny everything. We do not want any revolution. It's just a sort of rebellion. So there remains enough to do to fulfill. In many, this has led to such a high degree of frustration and desperation in the old white men in Fridays for Future, for example. So in the end, probably we'll settle to the following, James. You have created a great world, okay, but in return, you should talk less with less bias about it. So I must say, Tristan and Matthias, I am proud to have been part of such a testosterone-driven camp. Thank you very much for your attention to you men, brothers, warriors, hunters, gatherers out there. And I pass the floor to John. Dear men, thank you very much for this outstanding contribution. Thank you from the bottom of my heart to Matthias and Tristan Horx. I'm deeply impressed. I was so happy to have you at our conference. I hope it's not the last time. So I am so keen on learning more from you and hearing more from you. I wish you a fantastic day and see you soon at this or that event. See you next time.